I say rather than that apostate should flourish here, I will unsheath my bowie knife and conquer or die. Great commotion in the congregation and a simultaneous burst of feeling, assenting to the declaration. Now, you nasty apostates, clear out, or judgment will be put to the line, and righteousness to the plummet. Voices generally, go it, go it. If you say it is right, raise your hands, all hands up. Let us call upon the Lord to assist us in this and every good work. Brigham Young, Journal of Discourses, March 27, 1853. Hello, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn Heide, and we're here today to talk about the Lion of the Lord, as Zelwyn told me not to say, Brigham Young, as he was known historically by his people, the Lion of the Lord. Zelwyn, how are you?
I'm doing great, Willie. It's a beautiful day here. Things have kind of warmed up a little bit. I don't think we're fully out of winter yet, but it's definitely a very nice day, and I will admit that I'm enjoying the warmer weather a little bit. It kind of feels nice to not have to put on a heavy, fur coat every time I go out. So, what about you, Willie? How are things out your way?
Well, at the beginning of the week, I went down to beautiful Hot Springs, Arkansas, and checked out some 19th century style medicine, which is my jam. Lovely town. Weather was beautiful. Came home next day, promptly got a flash flood, such as living in Arkansas. It is presently in the 50s as I record now with a river flood warning, but getting much warmer. Spring is here. God is in heaven. It's feeling pretty good.
Sounds like a plan. I saw pictures of your health spa or whatever you want to call it. And it looked like you were sailing on the Titanic. I mean, it was kind of amazing with the equipment that you were using. So,
right. We need to bring back Indian clubs for exercise. It's not just for the Iron Sheik. Speaking of, I am a unabashed proponent of, hydropathy, if you will. And even, Mr. John Harvey Kellogg had some of his inventions on the RMS Titanic, if you were aware. We should do an episode about Kellogg.
That would be a good one, yes. Dealing with all of his ideas that have even influenced the way that we eat today, whether we like it or not.
Whether we like it or not. He had some, shall we say, extremist views on some things.
That's putting it lightly. But
right. We'll have to put a content warning. But at the same time, get fiber and exercise, and hot and cold water can cure a lot of things. I can get behind that. I'm behind that. This is not for legal purposes. This is not medical advice.
We'll make that very clear. Yes. Well, for a second I thought you were going to say you're a proponent of the Iron Sheik, but then you went a different direction. So
I am a proponent of the Iron Sheik.
Keeps you humble.
You remember, we all remember when Bob Backlund was finally able to do the clubs. Classic WWF.
It's always a good time. Absolutely.
Right. We should do a classic wrestling episode. If I could wedge it into the Word Fitly theme, I would. Because I believe in revival in the churches, and I believe that we need to make wrestling great again.
I'm sure you'll work it in somehow. We'll do the theology of wrestling or something.
Right. We'll do the Ric Flair tribute episode.
Wrestling with the Lord as seen through Ric Flair. I like it.
Yeah, it's no worse than some of these movie reviews that we see come out. The spirituality of Batman. We don't need that. But if it means that I can do the spirituality of WrestleMania 10, I can.
It'll be a good time.
Right. This episode dedicated in the memory of Scott Hall, Razor Ramon, by the way. F forever, rest in peace.
F forever, indeed. Well, Willie, we should probably dig into our actual subject today, talking about Brigham Young. But first of all, why are we coming back to it? It's been about roughly 1,500 years since we
I think that we did the Mormon succession crisis. We recorded it immediately after the assassination of Joseph Smith, if that's how long ago it feels.
Right.
Yeah, no, it's time to get back to it. You might see me pop up in a Mormon setting before too long on a certain podcast. You'll figure that out. I said, pop up in a Mormon setting, like I'm going to show up in a temple. No, but you might see me involved in a Mormon dialogue before too long. So a good time to get back at it. And I'm not going to announce what that is because I don't want to bury anybody's lead. I'll put it that way.
Fair enough.
But looking forward to that. When it comes out, we'll promote it. But of course, Mormon history is my jam. And we've promised to get back to this for years now.
Literally.
And we're here. So if you go back into the Word Fitly catalog, way back in the early days, we didn't even record on microphones. We just yelled loudly and the skies imprinted it. We did a 2-parter on the life of Joseph Smith, and then we did an hour on the succession crisis after he dies. So who is going to run the Mormon Church? We focused a bit on some of the forgotten figures, at least forgotten for most of our audience. And we said that we would come back and talk about Brigham Young at length. And you have to. He is the most significant Latter-day Saint leader post Joseph Smith. And while there are Mormon groups who choose not to follow him, by far most Mormons of the world do, because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the Brighamite church. They are the people who follow Brigham out to Utah. So you cannot understand Mormonism and its development as popularly understood apart from Brigham Young. You can't understand American history apart from Brigham Young. And this is where, Zelwyn, I actually think there has been some Mormon discrimination happen in American history, because the settlement of Utah is so important to the American West, especially historically, with skirmishes and just the sheer size of the territory and court cases, federally involved in it. And it is just ignored by many historians. It's ignored by popular culture too. There's a lot of good movies that could be made out of this, I suppose. There should be more books written, and there are plenty of books out there. But when we think of the West, you'll think of your cowboys, and you'll think of, other things like that, or Deadwood, the Dakotas and areas like that. But Deseret, Utah, does not get the historical attention that I feel it deserves.
Fair enough. Would you say then that, for our listeners, especially today, an understanding of Brigham Young, even in broad outlines, would it help them in understanding how to approach Mormons, for example? Do we have practical applications with this?
Absolutely. I think it does, because, a lot of people will say, well, Joseph Smith taught this. Well, no, a lot of LDS doctrine develops after Joseph. Now, some of these things you get the genesis of in his lifetime, but it really is expounded on in the lifetime of Brigham Young, during the tenure of Brigham Young. So once Brigham Young takes control, things like polygamy become open and more clear. We're going to talk about Adam God doctrine, what that means, blood atonement. Mormons do not deny that their doctrine develops. And yet we sometimes think that Joseph Smith sat down and wrote all this stuff. That's absolutely untrue. So as you're talking with Mormons and, contending for the faith or whatever, it's important to know these things. And so we'll talk about Brigham Young, and we'll talk about some things that are specific to him, or the ban of blacks in the priesthood, things like that, things that don't apply to the LDS church today, and yet have their roots directly in him. And so he represents a galvanization of certain positions. He represents a development of certain positions. So, more than any one person who is responsible for Mormon culture as we understand it, you have to give credit to him. He's the one that brings them to Utah, and that's where they're able to develop their own customs, their own folklore, everything. It comes after him, and in his era predominantly. So I think to understand Utah Mormons, you have to understand Brigham Young, to understand their fortress mentality, which I think is perfectly justified, frankly. The way they build their communities and what they went through, it absolutely makes sense. You have to understand, one, you have to go back and listen to the Joseph Smith episodes to see how we got here, to see what they sort of suffered in Missouri and Illinois and Ohio, but Ohio is a tricky one. And then we're going to talk about what they deal with as they go out west. So you have to understand this period to understand why Utah is the way it is. And I don't mean that in a negative. I feel like I could very comfortably live out there, even though they would treat me as a Gentile. But that's fine.
You'd be okay with that.
Yeah, I'm an Englishman in the Missouri Synod, so
Yeah, we're already Gentiles, as it were.
Right.
Well, just a quick question before we get into talking about Brigham specifically. Then, would you say that? I know that in the past, when we were dealing with the tensions in Illinois and stuff like that, and a lot of the problems that were coming up between Mormons and the rest of their neighbors, kind of a thing. Would you say that a lot of the reputation that Mormons get comes from the time of Brigham Young? I mean, I'm thinking, like, for example, Conan Doyle, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, writing Sherlock Holmes with a specifically kind of anti-Mormon slant in one of his stories.
Yeah, well, by that time, they're already out there. Yeah, so, yeah, certainly what he's talking about. But there are accusations against the Mormons that happen before Brigham Young.
Right.
And they started to get a reputation. Like, I'll give you an example. I was trying to find some early LCMS interactions with Mormons. Couldn't find much. But I did find a quote from Walther, and it was in German. And and basically, he's making an argument about when the state can enforce religious laws or stop certain religious expressions. And he goes, an example is the Mormons. They were kicked out of wherever because of their thievery. And so the government is justified in suppressing that religion for that reason.
All right.
Even though even these things had reached somebody like CFW Walther, which I think is a little bit of an unfair, but that even by the mid 1800s, or it's late 1800s when he's writing this, that perception had stuck there, and he tied it directly to their early days in like Missouri and Illinois.
Sure.
And it was a little bit disturbing to see him use that as a, because of their thievery, it's okay, the government can do what they want. Like, hope they never accuse us of anything, CF.
Hope it never comes to, where we are now or anything.
Yeah. There could be no unintended consequences from that. And really, Mormonism, and especially in Brigham Young's day, because they're going to be run out by state militias in Joseph's day.
Right.
Now they're going to come up against the federal government in Brigham Young's day. And it's really hard for me, to not be like based, because they're out there trying to do their own thing, trying to live their own life. And it's going to get very complicated because there are deaths involved and there is bloodshed. I understand that. I'm not trying to make light of that. But, I'm very hesitant on the whole, let's send in federal agents to destroy people because they're different or because they're weird. Now, I know some of our audience will be surprised to hear me say that or not like that I say that, but I still stand on that to a degree. You can't be, it's just, I don't want to see that encouraged. Right. Because
that doesn't set nasty precedents in American history either, right?
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about a people who are about self-determination. And what we're going to struggle with here as we discuss it is the fact that Brigham Young is controversial in American history. And I think for some Mormons, he's controversial because of some of his views and some of his attitudes. My job is to not judge based on that. It just is what it is. And to kind of go from there. They'll say, well, he's a charismatic cult leader who led his people to to free American land or to cheap American land. That's disturbing. Like, okay, do you really want to play this game, Missouri Synod?
I knew it was coming.
Well, because that part of it is not the weird part. This is what every religious group was doing in America. This is why they were coming to America in the 19th century. To be free, to live alone, and to build their own communities. That's the fact.
As I sit here in North Dakota, the product of
right.
homesteading.
Well, and I hear Lutherans today like, we need to build Lutheran communities, and we need to go out and buy land and build up a Lutheran society. Like, well, we did try it, and I'm not saying don't try it, but you're not doing anything that Brigham Young wasn't doing too. So at least recognize that you agree with them on that principle, that you want to build Zion out there. Just be honest about it.
Zion on the Mississippi, as it were.
Right.
But, well, we should probably start talking about Brigham himself then. So do you want to give us, let's start with his early life, not Wikipedia style, but...
Well, you won't find any of that in him.
But just kind of set us up for understanding who Brigham is and where he comes from.
Yeah, so Brigham Young is going to be born to a large family in Vermont. Very early, they move to upstate New York. And they basically sort of, move again sort of around New York. His mother contracts tuberculosis when he's in his teens. After she dies, they move to Tyrone, New York. His father remarries a widow who has several children. So at 16, he's out of the house. He's going to apprentice as a carpenter, glazer, painter. I mean, he's going to work that kind of work. So he is going to be a skilled laborer, which is important. We'll come to that. And so he's got that kind of itinerant sort of work happening. He loses his apprenticeship due to an economic downturn in 1819, the Panic of 1819. And so 1824, he marries Miriam Works, and that's going to be his first wife. And at this point, everybody's like, ha, 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 first wife. Well, okay, we're not to polygamy yet, all right? That's going to come way late in the episode. So marries his first wife. He's an interesting guy spiritually because he's a tobacco chewer, doesn't drink alcohol, but refuses to sign a temperance pledge because he doesn't want to be bound to it.
Okay.
So he wants to be temperate, but he feels like he doesn't want anything to bind his liberty, so he's not going to sign a temperance pledge. That's kind of funny. He joins the Methodist Church also in the 1820s. And there's a very interesting thing here. It's the Reformed Methodist Church, but you're going to hear Reformed Methodist and think Calvinist. I don't think that's actually that Reformed Methodist. This is a different one. So a Methodist offshoot. Brigham's going to, early on, he's going to insist that he is not baptized by sprinkling. He wants to be baptized by immersion. And that's going to be very important because he's eventually going to encounter a group of Mormon missionaries, and he's going to see in the Mormon Church things that he's already comfortable with. If it's the Reformed Methodist Church that we think it is, or that I think it is, they're going to be open to charismatic gifts, for example, like the early Mormons are. And he's going to encounter Mormons who are insisting on baptism by immersion. Remember, these restoration movements are wanting to go back to the early church, and they believe that the early church only practiced immersion. And that's common to pretty much every restorationist group that I know, because you can use restorationists to refer to the Mormons, but you can also use it, say, like the Stone Campbell restorationists, the Churches of Christ. So he's already really primed to accept some of the Mormon doctrine, Mormon things. So
well, let me ask this question though, because I know that this time period, and we've talked about this like in the Joseph episode, especially his early life episode. This was a time where there was a lot of religious turmoil, stuff like that, where it was not uncommon for people to kind of bounce back and forth between things.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. And that's really happening a lot in upstate New York. You've got revivals going on, your Second Great Awakening period, all kinds of new doctrines, all kinds of new movements. And then, people bouncing from church to church. Well, I'm convinced the Presbyterians are wrong. I'm going to go Methodist. Nope, the Methodists are too wacky. I'm going to go Baptist. Things like that. Thankfully, we don't have that today.
Well, did Brigham go through that, or did he just kind of end up in the Methodists and stay there until he became a Mormon? I guess is my question.
He's going to do the Methodist. He's going to have a bit of a stop off. So when he's in Minden, New York in the late 1820s, he's going to encounter Heber Kimball, who is an LDS member. And so he works at a sawmill. He's doing some odd jobs. He essentially leaves the Methodist Church. And he is I don't know what you'd want to call it. He's unaffiliated, I guess you'd say. And it seems as if Brigham Young is very interested in who has authority. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that who possesses true authority. He's already beginning to see there needs to be an institutional church, and the institutional church will have authority. To whom does Jesus give the keys? A language that we would use.
Right.
And language that the Mormons will use too. But they're going to use keys a bit differently than we will.
Sure.
But who has true authority? And so, he becomes soured with the Methodists, or his flame dies out, maybe we could say that. And so he's looking now. He's looking for something. He's looking for true authority. He's looking for legitimacy. And as we're coming to the end of this first segment, that's something that we bump into a lot too. And I think that every Christian who isn't just like I'm going to sit in a hole and read my Bible alone is kind of looking for that too. Where is the true church found, and by what authority? We would tend to lean more toward doctrinal authority, that where true doctrine is, there is authority. Roman Catholics would say, no, where the true hierarchy is, there is authority. And I think that Mormons, if we're honest, would be that way too, because they believe that true doctrine was restored, but part of their true doctrine is a church hierarchy that is revealed.
Although, if we're being fair, there are Lutherans among us who would kind of lean that way too, towards a more institutional Episcopal kind of a.
But I think we need to be fair here that it is a little bit odd to try to separate government from doctrine when most churches would believe that the Bible does teach a certain polity, and that would make it doctrinal.
Right.
We officially don't, and yet do bind people to Walther's church and ministry.
That's another episode, though.
But that is the truth, though, is it not?
Right.
But that's more of a voluntary agreement. So yeah, it's a tricky thing when talking about polity and authority, but these are not insignificant questions. And these are questions I think every Christian needs to wrestle with. If God has given authority and the office of the keys and the power of the keys to a certain church, then you ought to join it. Right?
Sure.
That's a fair question, I believe. I believe it's a fair question that any Christian could ask. And that's the point that Brigham Young is at. He is, for whatever reason, disenchanted by the Methodists, and maybe it's just because of, the guy's life has been hard, and he's bounced around, he's suffered setback after setback, but he is intensely interested in religion, but unsatisfied. But we're going to talk about where he finds satisfaction here right after the break. Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn Heide. We're talking about the American Moses, Brigham Young. I'm going to keep doing salacious titles until Zelwyn rage quits the podcast.
It's not so much that I'm going to rage quit, is that I'm just going to, edit you out or something.
Edit me
I'm
out.
not sure.
You're going to bleep me, make me think. Yeah, we don't even know what we're going to call this episode at this point. But remember, I can edit too.
Oh, I know.
We're debating who holds the keys to the church in this podcast right now, but we don't debate who holds the keys to Word Fitly Spoken. That is Mr. Zelwyn, the Adonis Heide.
He who edits controls the world.
That's right. Well, all right. So we left Brigham without a church home, and so now somewhere in the early 1830. He is given a copy of the Book of Mormon, and so he's going to read it. He's going to very quickly encounter some Latter-day Saint missionaries. And remember, this is all happening in New York. Missionaries are coming from Pennsylvania, all around. But he's going to read the Book of Mormon, and he's really going to become to believe what the church teaches. Now, this is, down to this day, how the church predominantly converts people. And I find that very interesting. Their methodology hasn't changed that much. Now, they're much more into apologetics and evidentialist apologetics and things like that. But you take all that away from Mormonism, and at the heart of it, and I think they would agree, is a testimony of the truth of the Book of Mormon. So you will read the Book of Mormon, and the Spirit will testify to your heart whether it's true or not. And that's essentially how they did it in the early days, too. Here's the story of the Book of Mormon, and read it and be open to the truth of it.
Yeah, like you say, when in my encounters with Mormons and stuff like that, or just like you hear about encounters with Mormonism, yeah, it's very much a read this and be convinced kind of a thing. Open your heart to it and see that it's true kind of a thing.
And one of the interesting things is, so I hear ex-Mormons predominantly, but some anti-Mormons say that Mormons hide their history. And I just don't think that's true. At least it's not been true in my lifetime. And I can go back even into the 70s and stuff, in the 80s when they're talking about seer stones and translation, stuff like that was allegedly hidden. But what I do find is, like a Mormon comes to your door and they bump into someone like me who actually wants to talk to him about what they believe and their history of it. And they really largely don't know their history. And you can use their history against them. That's why a lot of guys use it as a bludgeon. I think that it's a good door to talk to them about religious things, if I can put it that way. I'm willing to sit down and listen to them, but they're kind of trained. They're trained not to have these conversations, I think. And so, you can tell that they've got a series of questions that they have, but at the heart of it is, hey, read this, and it's true. That's kind of what it gets to. It's going to be a testimony about the Book of Mormon. Remember, for the LDS, the Bible is true insofar as it's translated correctly. The Book of Mormon is translated correctly. Ergo, this is where you should be. And so it was the same in Brigham Young's day, and he is convinced of it. And so on April 14th, 1832, he's baptized by Eleazar Miller and into what was then known as the Church of Christ. Much simpler name then. Now they're the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but you got to spell it correctly and put the hyphen in and watch your capitalization. Yeah.
Not that happens with any other body either, but
No. That would never happen. So more of the people that he's around end up baptized too. So he and some acquaintances and friends convert together. And he really begins to spread the gospel, to spread the restored gospel, what the Mormons call the restored gospel. Right. I've got to be careful here. Sometimes I'm reading Mormon history, I'm using Mormon terms. So restored gospel is what I'm talking about here, what they call the restored gospel. He begins spreading the message of the Book of Mormon there, lest anybody accuse me of something.
So, I think the fairest way of putting it is we're trying to present it as they would understand it, like try to give a fair presentation of what is happening, so that then we can talk about the issues.
If I'm not being fair, I don't deserve fairness myself.
It's a good quote,
right? And I will steal it, and I'm not going to tell you who it's attributed to. But he's a good Scot, so we'll leave it at that. So he's going to go down to Ohio eventually and meet with Joseph Smith, and they are going to become rather close. And we're not going to spend an inordinate amount of time on the death of Joseph and everything and the succession crisis because we've got hours on that. You can go listen. He's going to go down to Ohio, go down to Kirtland, become, really entrenched in the Latter-day Saint movement. All right. So by 1833, he's moved to Ohio, and his wife has died. His first wife has died, and he's going to marry a Mary Ann Angle by then. And so he's preaching. So he's going to preach more and more, eventually be sent on a mission. He's going to travel to Missouri. He's eventually going to travel to England. He's going to be one of the people who is in the Hebrew classes at Kirtland, because one of the early things about the Mormons, especially Joseph Smith, was they are very big on languages. So it's not all seer stones and the Urim and Thummim. They bring an actual Hebrew teacher in to teach them languages. They legitimately want to be an educated body. And they legitimately believe that they're going to be able to translate these old documents and find biblical things in them. They truly believe in this. The translation process early on is much more traditional translation.
Sure. Well, let me ask you this question though, Willie, because we've gone from Brigham being kind of just a convert to where we're eventually going to see him leading the Mormons by the time Joseph dies.
Correct.
Okay. So was it his connection with Joseph that kind of rocketed him up to this position? Was there something else that how did he go from nobody to, the top dog in that period of time?
So early on when he meets Joseph Smith, and keep in mind, this is a very different Mormonism from what you have today. It's visionary. It's charismatic. Brigham Young is a tongue speaker. He sees someone speaking in tongues, and he speaks tongues around Joseph Smith. He is seen as a man of great spiritual power very early on.
Okay.
This is the Kirtland, Ohio era, so they're claiming to see there's mass visions of angels flying around the temple, things like that. He is seen as someone with particular zeal and particular power, for lack of a better term. And so he is going to quickly rise up. I don't think this is a cronyism thing. He's a man who is seen as having particular gifts. So by May 1835, he is ordained a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, one of the first the 12 apostles in Mormonism. And then he's sent to New York to go get converts. And so he is going to be receiving what they claim is divine revelation. He is part of the dedication of the Kirtland Temple at the time. So very, very quickly after his conversion, within a few years, he's risen up. His conversion is legitimate. I'll put it that way. It is a sincere conversion because he goes from a kind of nominal Methodist to a very zealous restorationist. He is going to go around preaching and proclaiming the Book of Mormon and its doctrines. And so a corollary to that, remember, the Book of Mormon is a testimony of what happens to an ancient people and then Jesus visiting them and preaching the gospel to them. The restored gospel is different. The restored gospel is that authority given to Joseph Smith and then given to the Church of Christ on earth as restored in him to forgive sins, to baptize, things like that, to receive revelation. So the two are intensely connected, but he is going about preaching that the church has been restored. Here's the Book of Mormon that testifies to that. And here's the prophet here. He becomes a sincere believer in this. And by the early 1840s, he's president of the 12 apostles. But what happens in between all that is, so he's going to go on these missions, New York and New England. He's going to convert some people. He's going to bring them down to Ohio, to Kirtland. The Kirtland Safety Society is going to fail, and they've got to get out of town pretty quick. They end up in Missouri, and then at that point, he's president of the 12. He's apostle, so they send people from Missouri to Illinois, and then he's going to spend a year in England. Okay, so he's going to bounce around. He's really going to be the guy early on that's going to go out and get people, and at that time, he's calling them to come to Missouri or come to Illinois, if they can. And I think that's going to be very important to then, when they go out west to Utah, calling them out there. There's been really a gathering that you don't really see in Mormonism today, where it's, they understood they would have converts who wouldn't gather, but there is this big push to convert to the restored gospel and to gather in the Americas to await the millennial kingdom and the second coming.
Sure. Well, now, okay, so we got them, we're up to Illinois, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, go back, listen to the previous episodes. We talk about all the things that happened in Illinois, especially with, let's say, the death of Joseph. Now, We should probably move forward then to talking about when Brigham Young kind of takes the reins and actually wants to go out to Utah. So what starts that? Why does he come to this conclusion? How does that begin to progress?
Sure. Okay. So if you want to hear more about the polygamy stuff, we're going to do a whole episode dedicated to Mormon doctrine, the development of that. It appears that polygamy comes up in Nauvoo. The Mormons are not, that's in Illinois. The Mormons are not really welcome wherever they go. The debate is, hey, why is Joseph Smith killed? Joseph and his brother, why are they killed? Did it have to do with polygamy? Did it have to do with this? Go listen to the Joseph Smith episodes if you want a fuller take on that. But Joseph's going to be killed. And then you're going to have the succession crisis. At that time, Young is out east in the eastern states when all this is going on, and it's going to lead to the succession crisis, yada, yada, yada. But the majority end up following Young. Young claims that he has leadership. People back him. Again, whole episode on that if you want to really see. So we're not going to talk about the separate things. So anyway, there's conflict in Nauvoo. And it's not going to be good. They can't really settle. The government's still after them. The government wants them gone. Militias want them gone. They can't go to Missouri still. Technically, there's an extermination order on Mormons until the 70s in the state of Missouri. And 1970s. He sees that his people need a safe place. It's not going to be Illinois. Nauvoo, Illinois, remember, rivals Chicago for size at the time. That makes the government nervous. We're going to go out to Salt Lake Valley, which isn't even part of America then, and we're going to make a place. They settle in Nebraska at winter quarters in the mid 1840s, and then head on out to Great Salt Lake. By the time they get out there, we fought a war with Mexico, and it's ours. So, so good. And there's the famous, he's actually asked why to do it, and he's like, "Look, I'm trying to paraphrase him here, but it's basically." everywhere we've gone, it's been rough, but God told me to go here and we're going to prosper here. This is the place. This is the place we're going to go. So he considers it the place God's telling him to go. And they've been kicked out everywhere they've went. Violence has befallen them. And depending on which side of the argument you want to come on, the Mormons had it coming. The Mormons didn't have it coming. Look, Huntsville Massacre, I don't care which side of that you're on. The Missouri militiamen killed women and children. And that's not cool. They killed Mormon women and children. So this fortress mentality is something that I can understand. Theology aside. And now, do I think that God told Brigham to go there? No. But that is, to answer your question, why they went out there.
Yeah,
and
sure.
And to be fair, they did go out there and prosper, but it wasn't easy.
Well, and that was actually going to be kind of my next question, because as much as I know about, like, especially the movement out to Utah, it was a particularly rough journey. And didn't Brigham make the journey like 2 or 3 times too, like going back and forth, kind of a thing? Right, and because they're going to try to get people to come out, and you got to convince people, right? Right. He names Salt Lake City. He organizes the city. I mean, this is where you see the weakness of Joseph Smith as an organizer and the strength of Brigham Young. Joseph Smith largely failed at his earthly endeavors because, the Kirtland Safety Society fails. His attempts at building communities fail. I don't see in him the great business organizer that Brigham Young is. But Brigham Young goes out there, founds the city, and organizes it immediately. I mean, he divides it into lots. He does all kinds of stuff. There's even rebaptisms. It's a little strange. But he plans the city. He plans it with modern-sized roads. It's very prescient in what he's trying to do. He's very forward-thinking. But he's a very gifted craftsman, and I think that helped. I think what he learned in building buildings and designing things, I think that all helped in him organizing the city. He's a very careful planner and very deliberate, and he wants his society to be well planned and self-sufficient, which is actually comes from Joseph Smith. This idea of collective living. The difference is Brigham Young seemed to have the skills and the vision to make it happen. Okay, here's another question then. Since you're talking about his organizational skills, a common trope, if you will, about Brigham is that he is something of a dictator, an autocrat. Is that founded or not? Well, let me clear up one thing too. I just want to say that when he's traveling back and forth, I'm sorry I didn't answer that clearly. He's traveling back to from Nebraska to Salt Lake, so he's not really. Anyway, is he a dictator? Yeah, I think he is an autocrat. But that is how the church is designed. Okay, and he is leading what they saw as a kingdom on earth. Now, he is going to have people under him that works. There are other people with authority, but the buck stops at Brigham Young. And I think that that's absolutely true. Nothing really happens apart from his say-so. And when people are going against him, they are going to suffer consequences for that, even if it's just excommunication. Sure. That will happen. And this is something that I find very interesting in Mormonism, and you find it early in the movement, and you find it in Brigham Young too. People would be excommunicated and rebaptized all the time. W. Phelps, for example, the famous Mormon hymn writer who wrote like Praise to the Man and If You Could Hide a Kolob, some of these really distinctive Mormon songs. He takes a plural wife without the permission of Brigham Young, because at this time, hey, you're not supposed to be doing that. It's not been made clear. And he's excommunicated for it for like 2 days and then brought back in and rebaptized back into the church. So you see this excommunication rebaptism thing all the time. And that is part of who has authority, because you did it without my authority, you are now out. And I think he did that to Phelps just to make a point, but whatever. Sure. So are you saying then that the stereotype of him as the autocrat is well founded, or is there? I mean, how much of it is hyperbole? How much of it is real? I guess is my question. Well, I think it depends on, and I think you can read him both ways. There's no question that he has high authority, right? And he has both legitimate political authority, because he is going to be named governor of the Utah Territory in the 1850s. So he has legitimate political authority. And his religious authority, as far as his followers go, are unquestioned. The debate is, was he a benevolent dictator or not? Right.
And I think that depends on which side of Brigham Young you're on. I think there's evidence that he was willing to let other people take the fall for things, like the Mountain Meadows Massacre. That's the big debate. These people American settlers were killed by what they claimed were Indians, and the historical record seems to think that they were killed by Mormons at the behest of Brigham Young. So that's where it gets very murky. Was he just this very bloody, sending out people to kill people kind of thing? Or was he a very kind man? Was he only taking these extreme measures to protect his people? That's the historical debate.
Sure.
But I don't think you can come to any conclusion without at least agreeing that he was a very powerful autocrat.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, even like you say, even if it comes down to he was using it for the benefit of his own, that doesn't change the fact that he is taking some pretty hard measures on his own authority, kind of a thing. So
yeah,
you can
100%.
You can have it both ways, is what I'm saying.
Right. Well, we've just now got to Utah, but we've got to take our next break. We'll be right back with more Word Fitly Spoken right after this. Welcome back, everyone. You are listening to A Word Fitly Spoken. Here now we're talking about the Deseret. We're talking about Brigham Young. We're talking about all kinds of fun stuff. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn and Heide. Let's see how far we can get into American history here. So, so they're heading out to Utah, and this is really the era that Mormons commemorate as the pioneers. Okay, this is the pioneer era, and 1847, you have the really big push out west. Travel conditions are not good, but they're all going to come. I mean, you have even the famous handcart pioneers. People are literally by hand pulling their carts and things like that. So you've got this giant territory that Brigham wants to establish, the nation of Deseret. And eventually that's going to evolve into the state of Utah. But before that, it's the Utah Territory, which is created in 1850. And Brigham Young is going to be governor of that. And he's appointed in 1851. And so he's got a lot of things to do. He has to deal with Indians, organize a militia. They're going to build roads, bridges. The Transcontinental Railroad is going to be involved in this. Brigham wants his city to be self-sufficient, but he also wants the territory to be a very important hub because he understands the importance of bringing that income into the territory.
Well, let me ask this question, though. So, okay, the Mormons go out to Utah because of, let's say, persecution, to put it in a simple term. Mm-hmm. Nobody really accepts them. They can't really find anywhere. How does Utah end up becoming a territory? You would think that they didn't want anything to do with the Mormons. How does that come about? Well,
through the Mexican-American War, we get the territory.
Okay.
You have a ton of Mormons out there. What are they going to do? So it's the prudent thing to do.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I because they're going to send somebody out to replace him in 1858 after the Utah War. He's not going to last. Well, he lasts a few years, but that's a really hard territory to govern if you're not a Mormon.
Well, now, okay, let's not bury the lead, though. What do you mean by the Utah War?
All right. This is Buchanan's blunder. Okay, this is where the U.S. government tries to fight a war with the Mormons for the Utah Territory. So it lasts about a year, a little over a year, May 1857 to July 1858. There are, some deaths here, but it's not major. Mostly civilians, unfortunately. And this is a war over polygamy and slavery and self-government. And so they're going to fight it. James Buchanan's president. It doesn't turn out well. So without going into, we could do a whole episode just on that, but here's what happens. So the newspapers are writing everything. The Mormons are portrayed as just these fanatics out there that are shooting the army every time they come to try to civilize them. So they've got Governor Cumming now. He's placed in office, and the whole Utah War is just an embarrassment for President Buchanan. So he does not officially notify Brigham Young that he's being replaced, number one. Okay. So Cumming just kind of shows up. Hey, I'm the governor now. So it didn't go well. He sends the troops out, the expedition out way too late. He does not investigate whether or not Utahns are disloyal to the United States. And he doesn't supply the troops and the people of the expedition. So there's no communication, there's no supplies, and it's just not good.
How did he expect to win this war?
Well, we all know what Andrew Jackson said about James Buchanan. So yeah, it's so it just doesn't do well. But the Utah War is kind of the beginning of the end for the Mormon fortress, as it were. Gentiles are going to come in after that, and the federal government is going to dominate. The Transcontinental Railroad comes in 1869, right? It's completed then. So you're going to have Gentiles, as they would call them, non-Mormons coming in. And you're going to have conflicts between Mormons and the government. It's going to be mostly about polygamy. That's going to go on for the next few decades until 1896. And really, this isn't going to be resolved until the early 1900s, because there's even the Smoot hearings, which is saying, hey, can a Mormon even hold a government office, elected or not? So, but the Utah War is a blunder because they think they're going to be able to go in and pacify the Mormons, and they're just not. But it does end with Brigham Young stepping down, but he's still, a very, he's still the head of the Mormon Church. So, right. What can you do?
Right.
And, this whole war is tied up into slavery because Young supports slavery and wanted to actually legalize it and things like that in the territory. So it's all tied up in the political debates of the day. So it's not all about religion at the time. It's the slavery thing, federal sovereignty versus state sovereignty, religious sovereignty, things like that. That's why the Utah War is fought.
To be fair, most wars that are supposedly about religion in history are almost never exclusively religious questions. I mean, even you have like the European wars where they have those conflicts. There was a lot of political issues at work in those as well. So
absolutely,
we don't. I mean, that's sometimes a slur that is spread against just religion in general. Like, oh, it causes all these wars. Well, no, I mean, there's a lot more to it than that. But that's just a side note. So
yeah,
okay, but so he's no longer governor, and he is still the head of the church. I mean, we got to be coming up towards the end of his life, right? Because when does he die?
Well, he's no longer governor in 1858. He lives until 1877. And, really, time's not going to permit us to go into Mountain Meadows and things like that. That'll be a discussion for another time. His legacy is going to be tarnished a little bit in history books because of the war, because of his failure to create the state of Deseret, the Compromise of 1850, which gives you the Utah Territory. That's why he's governor. So Utah War happens. So that's done. A lot of the controversial stuff is all around that time. So that's when you get Mountain Meadows, the murder of the settlers coming through, things like that. He is going to still, though, be leading his people throughout that time. And so he's got another 19 years left. Mormon doctrine is going to continue to develop a bit. Brigham Young, it's clear to see where he stood on stuff, and I suppose we can talk about that. But parallel to his development of society is his development of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so he is going to go about building temples in the Utah Territory, which is going to become very important. Now, of course, the Salt Lake Temple it's just the groundbreaking that happens in 1853, but he sees construction of the Salt Lake Tabernacle, temples elsewhere in Utah. and what's called the endowment house, which is where they did the temple ordinances until the temple was built. Now, at this point, you're going, hey, Willie, what are you talking about? What's a temple here? Are they sacrificing animals? No. This is where the Mormons will go, and they have a temple in Kirtland, and they have a temple in Nauvoo, but the temple in Kirtland is a little bit different. It's a multi-purpose building. Nauvoo is as well, but the Nauvoo temple is going to be closer to the temples that we'll see in Utah. And the temple model in Utah is kind of what we see today, where, you're going to go in and they have these semi-secret rituals called endowments, whereby, they're renewing their covenants with God. It's where they're sealed forever as married couples. It's where baptisms for the dead happen. That's why these temples are built, for these ordinances. And this is unique to Mormonism. The sealing forever so that you'll be married even in the afterlife. The proxy baptisms, things like that. Brigham Young is the great temple builder. He really sets the course for this. Although Joseph develops it, Brigham Young is the one who really spreads it and solidifies it.
Now, remind me again, what do they call the more local meeting houses? Is that what they're called? Okay.
Yeah, and that's what you would think of closer to a typical church.
Right. But my question with the meeting houses is that an institution that starts in his time as well, or is he just building temples?
You're going to have the meeting houses, or at least some form of that. I mean, early on, it's going to be house churches.
Okay.
It's like any group that develops. You kind of start meeting where you can, right, and then you get the established church buildings. But even in the Kirtland days and in the Nauvoo days, a lot of times they're just meeting outside.
Okay.
Or meeting like in a room in the temple. Like I said, they're more multi-purpose then. The blueprint for the meeting houses, I think, comes a little bit later because they're all I know it does because they're all standardized now. And what I find interesting is, so in the early days, you might meet wherever you could. Meet in a barn, meet in a tree stump, bring a blanket, sit down. Nowadays, everything really is rather cookie cutter in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. One of the things they're going to accuse even Brigham of, and they accuse the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints of down to this day, is just amassing wealth. So Brigham Young has a nice house, and Salt Lake City is a nice city in its day and today. And they'll say, well, the church is just hoarding all this money to make themselves rich. I actually am not sure if that's true. Now, with Brigham, what they're going to say is, well, he let the handcart pioneers starve, and he let people starve while he's trucking in tobacco and other stuff for himself. There's all these accusations. But you have that everywhere. There's a chief leader at the top. Right. Bishop Stephan has entered the chat. But today, I guess maybe I'm just not unsettled by them having $4 billion. And I'll tell you why. And this is why I talk about the cookie cutter approach. And you talk about top-down leadership. Well, it's not been too long ago that if you started a new Mormon church or Mormon meeting house, you would have to pay to build your own building like we do in our churches. If we want to start a new church, members are going to have to pony up.
Right.
Well, nowadays, the denomination pays for construction of new meeting houses. You get enough people, you have a need for it, they will build a new church. Now, they probably have the same problem we do with closing them.
Right.
It's probably harder to close than to open, but they do take a lot of that money and they put it into storehouses, to feed the hungry, charitable work, and building churches. Or building meeting houses, I should say more properly. And I think that you saw this even down to Brigham's day. They are paying for the building of the temples. They're paying for the building of that. Now, they are taking donations. They have to. Sometimes, like especially in the Nauvoo temple, that Joseph Smith's era is my expertise more than anything. So in Joseph Smith's era, they're building the Nauvoo temple, and they would take, say, 1 day in 7, or 1 day in 10, and would go and work on the temple. Members would, and wouldn't be paid, but some would. So the skilled craftsmen, for example, the people who built the sunstones on the temple, they were actually, as I understand, compensated for their work. And that was coming from funds, given to the church and then distributed. So from Brigham Young's day, I say all that to say this: there has been this effort at top-down organization and this idea that funds would go up, but then would be redistributed down. And say what you want about them, I think it's kind of cool that they can at least fund the building of churches.
Well,
meeting houses.
there's certainly something to be said for that. I mean, would that we could do the same. We even have troubles with, funding our missionaries and stuff like that. So it would be nice to have more of an endowment to be able to take care of many of these things as they do. But, okay, so as we're coming to the end of the episode then, and we're kind of dealing with, we're not going to be able to get to the theology of Brigham at this point. That'll have to be saved for another episode. But is there anything else that we need to cover about him? Do you want to talk about his legacy in general, kind of how he's viewed even by the Mormons today? How do you want to wrap up our discussion of Brigham, Willie?
Sure. So Brigham Young is controversial to some Mormons today because of his views on race and on slavery. I think some are embarrassed by that. Brigham Young is a man of his time, so I'm not going to come down upon that. And we'll talk about polygamy more once we do the theology episode. That's where it's more proper. But this is where he tends to be. Some Mormons are uncomfortable with his views on race, as if he's any different than any other white guy of his day. Right. But the fact is, he does put a ban on blacks holding the priesthood that is not suspended, until well into the 1900s. And that's always been a thing. One of our critiques of Mormonism is, hey, this was the doctrine given on high to your prophet from God, who says this is just the way it is, and then you guys could just change it. That's one of the things that concerns us about Mormonism. And I think that it's disturbing to some Mormons too, for two reasons. One, a changing of revelation, what they consider to be divine revelation, and then two, something that they consider hateful. Doctrines like blood atonement, that some people's sins are so bad they can only be atoned for by the shedding of their blood, which seems to be something that Brigham Young taught. That's a little bit embarrassing to some modern Mormons. Polygamy itself is embarrassing to some modern Mormons. And again, I can't speak to them. So I think his legacy is one that divides some Mormons. And of course, on those doctrines, we have issues with those too, because we have a completely different understanding of the priesthood. We have a different understanding of marriage as well. So we're obviously going to reject those just on doctrinal grounds, whether they change it or not.
Right.
But even the idea of continuing revelation is problematic for us. And so he is very much a controversial character in American history. Even for us, does he order the murder of these settlers? That will be an issue, right? So what do we make of that? Do we judge him more harshly because he is a religious leader? That's where it's very hard for us to look at it, because we are pastors in a Christian church. And so for us to look at him as to someone that we say is not, a true teacher, not a true prophet, we would have to say that. But as a leader of his people, can we at least say, he really took extreme measures to protect his people, and what he's able to do in the Utah Territory is legitimately impressive? That's a hard thing for us to say, because we would not consider him a prophet. We would not consider him even close to being orthodox with his views on Adam-God doctrine, God being Adam, things like that, man becoming God. So he's certainly controversial for us, and more controversial even than Joseph Smith, because he lives longer and his doctrine is much more easily spelled out. Joseph Smith dies shortly after the King Follett Discourse, where he begins to talk about men becoming gods. Now, you do have the Book of Abraham in Joseph's time, which is talking about Kolob, the star closest to where God lives, and gods, plurality of gods, things like that. So you have that in Joseph's time. But all of the really controversial Mormon doctrines, even polygamy, while those things are present in Joseph's day, are not fully orbed until Brigham Young. So all of the really bizarre things that we tend to think of stereotypically with Mormonism come from the Brigham Young era. And so he is the man who galvanizes Mormonism, who, whether right or wrong, establishes how everybody will view Mormonism down to this day. On the other side of that, he is a great settler of the West. And we would not have Salt Lake City, we would not have the Utah Territory settled the way it was if it wasn't for him. Salt Lake City would not be kind of the shining city that it is today if it were not for him. And so he is doing the pioneer work that many others did, but because of the religious element to it, it's much more difficult to talk about, and difficult to talk about objectively.
Sure.
For historians, not for us.
Right, right. Okay, well, maybe as a last question then, and this is just kind of an overview of like, up to the present day. Would it be fair to say that Brigham shapes Mormonism in such a fundamental way that even for what will come after him, like it won't be as influential? Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think you're going to see someone, and whether they realize it or not, who is as influential as Brigham Young is. I mean, who in history is more influential than him? You could argue, okay, maybe, the president at the time that Utah's a state, but he still doesn't have that impact. I mean,
Right.
yeah, he changes polygamy, but that's still not the same thing. Russell Nelson is the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saint today. He's not going to, unless something changes, he's not going to have the impact that Brigham Young does. And, Ezra Taft Benson, very, notable for a number of reasons in Mormon history, not as big a deal. What do? The one who's president, cannot believe his name just escaped me. Who am I thinking of? Gordon B. Hinckley, who's president for 12 years. And, he's probably one of the most notable, one of the most accessible presidents of the Mormon Church in history. And he's on Larry King and everything. He is still not going to have the impact that Brigham Young does on the Latter-day Saint movement, in all due respect.
Sure. So it maybe in a practical sense, then, if we really want to understand Mormonism as it is today, as we said at the beginning, understanding Brigham is kind of the way to do that.
Well, yeah, and I mean, if even just for the fact that he's president longer than anybody.
Sure.
And remember, president for them is prophet too. President for us is guy we elect every 3 years. President for them is a living prophet among the people.
Right.
So.
Okay, Willie. I think we had an excellent discussion of Brigham. I'm looking forward to talking about Mormon doctrine more specifically, and hopefully we'll do that, before the next 1,500 years is up.
Right.
So.
Well, and remember, this is all building up to, you have to understand this to understand how Mormon doctrine develops. And plus, I just like talking about it, so. All right. Well, this has been A Word Fitly Spoken. If you like what you heard and want to know more, check us out, wordfitlyspoken.org, facebook.com/wordfitly, or Twitter @wordfitly. I'm Willie Grills here with Zelwyn and Heide. God love you, and God bless. I am more afraid that this people have so much confidence in their leaders that they will not inquire for themselves of God whether they are led by Him. I am fearful they settle down in a state of blind self-security, trusting their eternal destiny in the hands of their leaders with a reckless confidence that in itself would thwart the purposes of God and their salvation and weaken that influence they could give to their leaders, did they know for themselves, by the revelations of Jesus, that they are led in the right way. Let every man and woman know, by the whispering of the Spirit of God to themselves, whether their leaders are walking in the paths the Lord dictates or not. This has been my exhortation continually. Brigham Young, Journal of Discourses, January 12th, 1862.